Hello there, I wanted to make a dice box, maybe for something like Dungeons and Dragons. I don't play Dungeons and Dragons personally, but I thought it would be a fun project. And who knows, maybe one day I will try if I have a dice box. I started off with cutting up a piece of walnut, and then I used a router to hollow out the inside of my box. Here I just have the piece of walnut glued down with super glue to a wooden surface, just to make it stay in place, and that I can use the router to guide it along that edge. As you can see, the dice do not fit exactly if you just do one pass, so here I'm just marking up where I need a little bit of extra space for the larger dice. Then I'll go back with the router and just make it a little bit wider. Instead of trying to use a saw to create a really nice and straight cut, I decided I would use the router and then just guide our router along and then create that narrow piece of wall I need to complete the box. Unfortunately, the router doesn't cut deep enough, so I still need to use the saw to cut off that last piece. But I find these Japanese saws are really good for that kind of precision cutting. I'm planning on attaching the lid with magnets, so I realized I don't really have enough space on one of the sides for a magnet. Also thought it could be quite a nice reason to add some pop of color to it. So I found this piece of reddish wood, mahogany-ish perhaps, I'm not really sure what it is. So I just cut up the box a little bit, and then I just glued on this other piece of wood that will give me enough space to add a magnet, as well as hopefully making it look a little bit more interesting to this design. So I just glued everything up, and then I'm just using some simple sandpaper to just trim it down to size. And here I'm using the Japanese saw again to just try to saw as neatly as possible to get that the lid for the box. I'm using a piece of ash for this. And once that is cut up, I'm just using some double-sided tape and then back to the sandpaper to make sure that the lid fits perfectly with the edge of the box. Once that is done, it's time to drill some holes for the magnets. I found some dowel tenon centers and I'm just drilling a 8mm hole, which is the same size as the magnet. So I'm trying to use these centers to transfer to the lid exactly where I need to drill. And here I have built a weird little contraption to try to make sure I can actually center the lid on top of this. So I'm just using these right angle guides to try to get it as perfect as possible, just pressing it down a little bit to make that little divot. And next step is just drilling out the holes on the lid, and then we'll see if it fits or if it doesn't. To attach the magnets, I'm just using some fine minute epoxy. Just adding that to all the 4 holes and then pressing down the magnet into them. It's always fun to try some new stuff, so here I'm gonna try Kolrosing or Kolrosing. It's a bit tricky to film, but hopefully you will see in a minute what it actually is. But basically, you take a knife, you follow some lines, maybe you made a stencil or you freehand something directly on the wood. Take the knife, carve out those lines, and then when you're done, fill those holes that you created with the knife, so the little lines, with some kind of medium. The original way to use it would be coal, as the name says. You could also mix coffee with linseed oil, which is what I'm doing here, and that works really well. You can also use spices, and I'm sure there's many other ways. Paint pigments, they would work as well. They just need a medium like a linseed oil to actually penetrate a little bit deeper inside. And the first step there is I just sprayed on some glossy varnish. I discovered it's a lot easier to get a clean result if you first varnish your surface. If you varnish it first, the coffee doesn't go into the actual wood and stain it, so the contrast is much higher. So I just found a picture online of a D20 dice with 2 swords going through it. So I just printed that, and then I'm using a pencil to rub on the underside of the paper. I think it should be a little bit softer, but that's the only pen I had. And then I'm just using a click pencil with a fine point to just try to trace all those lines on top of the paper, and hopefully you transfer down that soft graphite from the softer pencil that you use on the bottom, and then hopefully you have transferred all those lines over to your piece of wood. In my case, it kind of worked. They got very, very dim though. So I think a better pencil would help a lot, but it was a good start. I had like the base shape of it, and then I can just use this little ruler to just fill out the lines better, so I can actually see them for carving with a knife. Once all the lines are drawn here, I'm just using some ground up coffee mixed with linseed oil. Then I'm just rubbing that into the lines. Just hopefully crushing some of those the coffee ground into the holes as well. And then just wiping everything off. And that's pretty much it. Because it's varnished, you're basically done. There's not that much you have to do. In my case, I will use some sandpaper to take off the varnish and then oil everything one more time. I also wanted to paint the inside of the box and perhaps even make a surface that's a little bit softer than the wood. So I'm mixing up some wood glue or PVA glue with some model color. It's just acrylic paint mixed with wood glue, and then I'm just using a brush to apply that all the way inside the box. In this case, the color I ended up with is kind of a really dark purple, which I thought fit really well with the walnuts. And here we go with some final sanding to 80 grit just before we apply oil as the finish. After applying the oil, I also realized I wanted to have a glossy finish to this one, and since shellac works great over an oil surface, I went out and got some shellac, and then I applied the shellac with just a brush. After I had applied the shellac and let it dry for about 2 hours, I used some fine steel wool to polish it, and then I repeated that process, I believe, 4 times. And here we got the final result. I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out. I think the glossy shellac finish turned out really nice. The Kolrosing turned out okay, that was fun to try. All in all, I'm pretty happy with it, and I think if I were to make several ones at the same time, it wouldn't take a lot longer. But I guess that's always the case when you always make one-off projects. Everything is a prototype, so it ends up taking quite a lot longer than you would have expected. So, to wrap things up, I'd just like to say thank you very much for watching.